In parts 1 and 2 of this series, we watched Dennis Prager, the dean of my alma mater, Prager University, go Devils, sit down, douse himself with gasoline, and set himself ablaze. He did this by arguing that an afterlife requires only a good and just God. After telling us that,
this life is filled with an immeasurable amount of injustice and suffering.
Then, after admitting that he has no idea what happens in this supposed afterlife,
people always ask me, so what happens in the afterlife? To which I can only respond, I don't know.
Dennis tells us that God will somehow make it up to us, again while admitting he has no idea how.
I don't know.
He just trusts that God exists, is good and just, and that his sense of goodness and justice aligns with ours, despite his God's history of ordering actions which we all now consider despicable. Perhaps God will make it up to us by allowing us to sing his praises for all eternity. Oh, dear leader, thank you for needlessly creating a world of immeasurable injustice and suffering for us, your children, whom you've made able to feel the pain and loss of this nightmare. Ooh, you are so big, so absolutely huge. Gosh, we're all really impressed down here, I can tell you. For someone who admits to having no idea what happens in this supposed afterlife,
I don't know.
Dennis sure seems to be certain of what will go on there, at least in terms of righting the injustice and suffering of this life, though he offers not a single detail.
I don't know.
This is what passes for religious thinking. No evidence, no specifics, no matter. It makes Dennis feel better.
My belief in God and the afterlife keeps me sane.
This kind of narcissism is indicative of the religious mindset in general. So long as my beliefs make me feel better, I don't have to care about the consequences thereof for the world at large. Had Prager given it a second thought, he'd have realized that the afterlife is actually one of those things making this life even more filled with the immeasurable injustice and suffering Dennis talks about. There are two direct ways the afterlife makes this life an even worse place, and a myriad of indirect ways of which we can only begin to touch the surface. First, the afterlife and Dennis's associated good and just God require believers to accept the injustice and suffering of this life and even embrace it as a potentially good thing. As English cleric John Wesley wrote, "The readiest way to escape from our sufferings is to be willing they should endure as long as God pleases." The theological reasoning goes something like this. If this good and just God created the world this way, filled with immeasurable injustice and suffering, clearly he must have done so for a very good reason. Injustice and suffering must be here for our benefit, as all things work for the benefit of those who love God. Injustice and suffering, it's reasoned, build character and bring one closer to God and Jesus in particular, whose suffering is the very source of our salvation. Though Dennis, being a Jew, can't take it quite that far. This reasoning led to centuries of people accepting their suffering as long as God pleases. You can see it right there in the PragerFU video. Dennis is not the slightest bit bothered or outraged by a supposedly good, all-knowing, all-powerful God who creates evil and a world filled with immeasurable injustice and suffering. Instead, Prager uses the afterlife to give God cover and tell you that everything will work out fine in the end. Trust him. What you're going through now will be made right. The afterlife, of which Dennis has no evidence or knowledge whatsoever,
I don't know,
will smooth everything over in the end. Somehow.
I don't know.
Just don't ask to see the fine print.
I don't know.
Prager wants you to feel better about the immeasurable injustice and suffering you're experiencing, but fixing it or being outraged by the God who created it, not so much. Christianity even went so far as to actually embrace suffering, literally encouraging people to gratuitously inflict suffering on themselves so that they might draw nearer to God. Pope John Paul II may have been one of those people so encouraged, bringing with him to his summer residence a favorite belt he might have used for self-flagellation. That's right, Pope John Paul II may have literally beaten the crap out of himself. He could have just called me. The second direct way the afterlife adds to our suffering is by trivializing this life, the only life we know.
I don't know.
It does that by comparing it and its brevity with the infinite. Don't concern yourselves with the injustice and suffering of this life. It's but a blip in the eternal scheme of things. These 30 or 40 years, now 70 or 80, mean nothing. And what we perceive as immeasurable injustice and suffering is actually negligible, infinitesimal when compared to the eternal bliss we'll experience in the hereafter. On a visceral level, which people have clearly understood over the centuries, the afterlife and its endless duration has convinced believers that this life is good for only one thing: entry into the next. Your entire life is but a chip to be traded in order to secure your seat in the hereafter. And if that means enduring the immeasurable injustice and suffering God has specifically planned for you, then so be it. Who are we to question the workings of a good and just God?
I don't know.
Of course, on the darker side, such thinking can turn into the complete negation of this life and its value, leading some to throw away this life completely in an act of martyrdom. Perhaps I should pull a Pascal here and ask believers, what if you're wrong? What if you're wrong about the existence of God? What if you're wrong about God's goodness? Or what if you're right about the existence of God, but wrong about his goodness or the afterlife?
I don't know.
In either of these scenarios, God could exist, but there's no afterlife for us. These are the kinds of unpleasant possibilities which lead believers to check their brains at the door in the first place. And that usually leads to the embrace of a particular religion whose doctrines regarding the afterlife lead to all of the indirect ways this silly idea has made life even more filled with immeasurable injustice and suffering. And that's what we'll talk about in Part 3B. I'm Me. Thanks for watching.